the man the NSPCC have called Britain's most dangerous and prolific child molester ever, Jimmy Savile, spent 11 successive New Year's Eves at Chequers, the most powerful residence in the land, as a guest of Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And today's police report on the 450 abuse crimes Jimmy Savile committed and the 34 known rapes begs the question, why was none of this published or reported in Britain's so-called free press, nor noticed by the police and prosecuted by them until after he was dead? The BBC is, of course, heavily implicated in Savile's paedophilia, allowing sexual assaults to take place on BBC premises. There is still our own Bristol case as well. BBC presenter and child molester Peter Rowell, who's now in jail. He was also one of the Prince Charles's ambassadors entrusted with assessing young people as part of the Prince's Trust scheme. So today, maybe some closure for victims and their families if they're still alive, but still no justice. Those that censored the transmission of Liz McKean's December 2011 Jimmy Savile Newsnight expose are still working at the BBC. Only the Director General George Entwistle was given a big payoff to walk. BBC under former Bath Tory MP and Cabinet Minister Chris Patten, of course they're both colleagues of each other. So I spoke to Michael Shrimpton about this very issue and first put to him questions about the Jimmy Savile and if he thought that the Tory party had really come clean about what Savile had been up to.
I'm Michael Shrimpton. My day job is barrister. I used to be an immigration judge many years ago. My other job is as an intelligence and national security consultant. I've just written my first major book, Spy Hunter. We weren't getting anywhere in the intelligence community. We were being blocked persistently and consistently in London and Washington, and it seemed to me that only by bringing public pressure to bear on politicians could you actually get anywhere. It's extraordinarily frustrating. Intelligence is about speaking truth to power, but if there's nobody in power able to act on the intelligence, then it's a little bit pointless gathering it in the first place. There are people still alive who are involved in the paedophile scandal, and obviously I'm not going to name them on a radio program, but the most prominent paedophile associated with the Savile ring was a man called Heath, who you may recall was Prime Minister and took us into the EEC. And Heath was recruited as something that Christopher Story published in 2005, something which was confirmed to me by Generalobus Marcus Wolf of the DVD and the Stasi. Heath was recruited by the Germans in 1937. I've said this in Spy Hunter. Heath was into little boys, and Savile was supplying them. A number of these boys were taken out of the 𝗧𝗿𝗱𝗃𝗃 home in Jersey. Savile was taking children from a children's home with the support of German assets in Jersey. Remember, the Germans used to run Jersey, and whenever the Germans overtake somewhere, there's always a stay-behind intelligence organization. German assets didn't pull out of Jersey in 1945. Only German troops marched out, they surrendered. The German intelligence operation in Jersey stayed on after 1945. Jersey was very important to the Germans because of offshore financing, because we do a lot of our offshore financing through Jersey. The banking in Jersey is quite interesting. And what was happening was that children's homes in the Channel Islands, particularly 𝗧𝗿𝗃𝗃 in Jersey, children were being taken from these homes, boys in the case of Heath, as he was gay, and a paedophile, were being taken onto his yacht, the Morning Cloud. There were in fact several Morning Clouds, but there was one in particular which won the Sydney-Hobart yacht race, which was eventually sunk in the English Channel, from memory. But it was the boat that was sunk on which most of the abuse took place. Savile was actually going out he went down to Jersey, and he was actually taking boys. There was another man involved as well, but Savile himself took boys from the children's home, where he was a guest, or welcome, onto the boat. So he was taking boys out onto Morning Cloud. Now, since Heath was well known, and since the boys were talking young men, it depends how you define child, but as a lawyer, one normally we define children as under the age of 14, which is the age of criminal responsibility. They were about that age, sadly, but they were old enough to know who was abusing them. It's quite clear that in most cases they weren't willing to be abused, and even if they were, at that age, we don't regard consent as informed consent. Defined in the United States have a phrase, statutory rape. The boys were murdered and thrown off the boat. Now, a very courageous Jersey police officer who was aware of the paedophile ring, was aware that boys were being supplied to politicians and key figures in Jersey, knowing that children had gone missing from the nursing home. There's no dispute about that. The police in Jersey were aware that they had missing kiddies. Their theory, which is quite perfectly reasonable theory, was that they must be buried in the grounds. And I think if you look at the files, you'll see there was an attempt to find their remains by digging up the grounds. Was it Lenny Harper? It's been some time since I looked at the file on this, but if you told me it was Lenny Harper, I wouldn't dispute that for a moment. What I do know is this police officer was very competent, very courageous, because he was up against a cabinet office-backed paedophile ring, and the investigation he was conducting was at some professional risk, and indeed I suspect his life was also at risk at one point, because he was getting close to some very uncomfortable truths for certain people in the cabinet office, GO2 in London, and certain people in Jersey, in the German network, which is, even today, there's still a German network in the Channel Islands. His theory that the boys had been buried in the grounds of the nursing home was a perfectly reasonable one. He was a good copper. Good theory, but wrong. The boys were in fact being taken to a boat. It happened to be a Heath's boat, or yacht, and they were murdered and thrown overboard. So there's no point, sadly, in looking for their graves. They don't have any grave except the sea. That's why the BBC and the Cabinet Office have been so keen to protect Savile. That's why the Cabinet Office in the 1980s were willing to back Savile to the point of giving him a position of authority at Broadmoor, which is an absolute... You don't put a paedophile in charge of Broadmoor. It's just like putting a lunatic in charge of the asylum, or a drunk in charge of a brewery, or David Cameron in charge of a government, no offence intended. The Cabinet Secretary at the time, who thankfully is no longer with us, Hunt, was also a paedophile, was in on this, met Savile. He was Catholic, met Savile, as did that very nice man, the late Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Basil Hume. Basil was not a paedophile, but knew Hunt and had a shrewd idea. He wasn't stupid. He had a shrewd idea of what had been going on, and I've no doubt was told to keep a lid on it. Hunt was in on it, so the Cabinet Secretary at the time was in on it, was aware of what was going on, was aware he had a Prime Minister who was involved not just in abusing young boys, but was murdering them as well. It's quite possible that there was a crewman on the yacht who did the actual murder. I'm not saying Heath necessarily bashed the boys on the boko and tossed them overboard. He may have had somebody do that for him, but he was certainly guilty of murder under English law as an accessory or on a joint enterprise basis. The Cabinet Secretary of the day knew that we had a Prime Minister who was vulnerable to charges of murder at the Old Bailey. Bit of a national security mess. And the Cabinet Secretary, as you can well imagine, was very keen to keep a tight lid on things. Hunt, of course, was working for the Germans and was very keen on British membership of the EEC, and it was Hunt and Heath between them who were responsible for Britain going to the EEC, along with another German spy exposed in Spy Hunter called Tony Barber.
Now, you're painting a picture of lots of sort of high-level paedophile characters in the centre of government. What on earth purpose would that serve?
Oh, if someone is inclined in that direction and you can supply them with boys, then you've got a hold on them, or girls. There's nothing worse for a politician than being exposed in the murder and sexual abuse of young people. And if you've got a politician who is abusing and killing young girls and boys, but boys or girls, then you've got a hold on them. Paedophilia is a wonderful means, if you're a hostile intelligence agency, of blackmailing politicians. The reason it's particularly disgusting, quite aside from the element of sexual abuse and coercion and corruption of young people, that's disgusting in and of itself. But what makes it particularly vile, and we saw this in the Madeleine McCann case, and that's why the Madeleine McCann case was so heartbreaking and tragic. If the children are, and I'm afraid with paedophilia we sometimes have babies being abused, but if you're not talking babies, if you're talking toddlers who are able to recognize the people who are abusing them, since the people, there's absolutely no point doing it unless the politician is high profile. Since you're talking about people who are on television, people who are high profile, you have to murder the children in order to protect your asset. So for the Germans, it was essential that the boys that were being taken onto the yacht, that was a death ride. When Jimmy Savile was taking, let's say, a 14-year-old boy down to Morning Cloud, handing him over to Heath or a member of the crew on the yacht, it was a death ride. That was that boy's last journey on Earth. because there was no way in the world, recognizing Herbert Heath, that he could be allowed back on shore. And 𝗧𝗹𝗶 must have known this, and that's partly why 𝗧𝗹𝗶 was probably deeply into religion. You often find this, in fact, that where people get involved in murder, their consciences start to eat at them, and they suddenly turn to religion late in life, and 𝗧𝗹𝗶, certainly there are signs that he did that.
David Rockefeller was a pedophile. There's a lot of survivors. I work with survivors. There are a lot of survivors out there of David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller had me trained as a spy. So I was a sex slave, of course, and I was an elite sex slave now. And I was trained as a spy through the mind control training. And so that week, I was sleeping with men, and then I would go report on their weaknesses or their sexual preferences to David Rockefeller. If he knows what they want, then he can give it to them sexually. So about Tudreau, I said that I could never please him as long as I was alive. That's how scary that was. It means that he couldn't kill me because at that point I was not a throwaway child. And he scared me enough so that I then tell Rockefeller that that's what he wants a child to kill.
Justin Trudeau's father, right? That's who you're talking about.
Yes.
Trance, Formation of America, True Life Story of a Mind Control Slave, The True Life Story of a CIA Mind Control Slave, by 𝗧𝗿𝗋𝗃𝗃. When Pierre Trudeau was elected Prime Minister of Canada in 1968, I often heard it said, Pierre Trudeau is one of ours, you know. I first heard this phrase cryptically referring to Trudeau's loyalty to the Vatican when Father Don was discussing him with my FEMA one Sunday after Mass. This fact circulated quickly among those I knew who were involved in the Catholic Jesuit aspect of Project Monarch. The summer after Trudeau was elected, my father took the family to Mackinac Island as usual. Climbing on a large statue on the grounds of the governor's mansion, I could see across the field to the Grand Hotel. I noticed Canadian flags flying amongst the American flags that lined the front of the old hotel. As I slid down off the statue, 𝗖𝗆𝗍𝗶𝗁𝗃 approached with a drink and a cigarette in his hand. Patting my hair into place, he said, "Straighten your shirt. I've got someone important for you to meet." I knew someone important was here because of those flags, I said, tucking my shirt into my pink shorts. When I was at the Vatican, 𝗲𝗍𝗃𝗃 began, I was told that Prime Minister Trudeau is a friend of the Pope. He thinks like one of us. A true Catholic. He likes Catholics. 𝗲𝗍𝗃𝗃 led me upstairs in the mansion, where Pierre Trudeau was lowering the window shades in a dimly lit bedroom crowded with antiques. 𝗲𝗍𝗃𝗃 closed the door behind me. Trudeau's tuxedo coat was neatly draped over a chair, which left him in his formal pants, white shirt, and a bright red cummerbund that caught my eye. "I like your sash," I said. "Hasn't anyone taught you silence yet?" His somber, gruff attitude was softened by his smooth, silky voice. Triggered into the part of me that endured the right to remain silent, I assumed Trudeau knew all about interdimensions according to my deliberately formed perceptions. I did not understand that interdimensions actually equated to the inner dimensions of my own compartmentalized mind. Likewise, I did not understand that keys to the kingdom referred to knowing the codes, keys, and triggers to my controlled mind. "Guy said you like Catholics," I said, repeating what 𝗲𝗍𝗃𝗃 had told me. "Are you the keeper of the keys?" Trudeau seemingly bore his cold, dark eyes right through me. "You can learn more from the school of thought than you can by asking precocious questions. Haven't you learned that children are to be seen and not heard?" "Is that a precocious question?" I asked. "What is a precocious question?" Trudeau sighed with impatience. "That is irrelevant. What matters is that you shut your mouth, still your mind, and enter the school of thought. Silence is a virtue. Listen to the silence in the stillness of your mind. Go deep inside your mind," he slowly led. "Deeper and deeper where it's quiet and still." Trudeau expertly manipulated my mind with sophisticated hypnotic language. Not only did he enlist my silence for the paedophile perversions he indulged in, but he instructed my school of thought in a manner that equated to programming. He laid a foundation for air-water programs that is a mirror-dimensional theme often used by NASA and others involved in Project Monarch. Playing off his own name, Pierre, he added a perverse twist to the theme that he accessed each time I was prostituted to him. Had I been capable of fear, I would have been afraid of Pierre Tudreau. Tudreau's slow, deliberate movements masked the brutal power of his body much the way his smooth, soft voice pierced my mind and intruded on my thoughts. The icy cold touch of his effeminate, manicured long fingers contrasted with the heat of his perversion, a perversion for which he blamed me and my contemptuous ways. In my childish ignorance, I believed Tudreau's demeanor and forward-combed hair were characteristic of his French descent. I know all about the French. I had bragged to my new grandpa Van while visiting his home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My mother's father had died shortly before Kennedy was assassinated, and my grandmother quickly latched onto a wealthy, highly political businessman from Milwaukee. She met Grandpa Van Vandenberg on the passenger cargo ship that traveled the waters of the Great Lakes, the Milwaukee Clipper. The Clipper transported cargo, including Cadillacs from Vandenberg Motors to Canada, as well as the drugs sanctioned by the local Coast Guard via the U.S. government that my father distributed. Sometimes I accompanied my father to the docks in Musken to pick up the drug shipment, which usually involved prostitution. Jerry Ford and Guy Vanderjagt combined business with pleasure in the ship's casinos on occasion, which is where the connection between my grandma and Grandpa Van was reportedly made. Grandpa Van knew Jerry Ford and subsequently was acquainted with Pierre Tudreau. What do you know about the French? Grandpa Van asked me as I sat on his living room floor petting the dog he just brought home. Improperly cued and dumbfounded by his question, I remained silent. I know you've met Pierre Tudreau, he prompted. I also know you love doggies. So I bought this dog for your grandma now, so you could enjoy him, too. His name is Pepe. He's a French poodle. I know all about the French, I said, mentally comparing the large French poodle in front of me to Tudreau. They have pretty nails. I stroked Pepe's painted toenails. They have funny hair. I petted Pepe's clipped fur. And they pee a lot, I giggled. You'd better take him outside, then, Grandpa Van told me, attaching Pepe's leash. After walking the dog past what felt like every tree in the neighborhood, I announced that I would call him PP. Uncle Bob filmed Pepe and me pornographically on numerous occasions, producing bestiality films that I would later learn Pierre Tudreau was privy to. Pepe remained a part of my experience long after Grandpa Van divorced himself from my grandma, and long after I developed beyond Tudreau's perversion for little children. I was most often helicoptered to ships, hotels, islands, or wherever, was to deliver this anonymous information. Once the information had been exchanged, I was helicoptered back. Henry created the programmed system for these communications. He was the mastermind of lots of their plan, and used me to further it. Kissinger, Bush, Reagan, Carter, Thatcher, Mitterrand, Trudeau, Gorbachev, Salinger, Ford, Nixon, etc. all participated.